It is the golden rule of kidnapping that speed ensures survival. A perpetrator infiltrates a target location, secures the victim, and vanishes into the darkness, leaving behind only the briefest of instructions. But in the early morning hours of December 26, 1996, within a sprawling, 25-room mansion in Boulder, Colorado, this fundamental principle of criminal behavior was radically abandoned. A ransom note was left behind, but it was not a hasty scrawl on a scrap of paper. It was a sprawling, 376-word manifesto spread across 3 pages, meticulously handwritten on a legal pad belonging to the victim's mother. Forensic experts estimate that composing and physically writing a document of this extreme length would require a perpetrator to remain stationary in a highly vulnerable central area of the home for roughly 30 to 45 minutes. This staggering operational risk presents a profound anomaly. Why would an intruder linger in the house of a wealthy corporate executive, carefully drafting hundreds of words, when the 6-year-old target of the alleged kidnapping was already lying dead in the basement wine cellar? The answer to why the JonBenét Ramsey ransom note was 3 pages long lies at the intersection of linguistic deception, cinematic fantasy, and the desperate staging of a crime scene. To comprehend the psychological dimensions of this unprecedented document, one must first examine the environment and the people involved. JonBenét Ramsey was a highly successful businessman, the president of Access Graphics, a computer distribution company that had just grossed over $1 billion and later became a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. His wife, Patricia, known as Patsy, was a former beauty queen and a prominent socialite who had enrolled their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét, in numerous child beauty pageants. JonBenét had won titles such as America's Royale Miss and Little Miss Colorado, bringing a localized fame to the family that would soon mutate into intense, unrelenting national media scrutiny. The family lived in a nearly 7,000-square-foot house in an affluent neighborhood, a labyrinthine structure that had been extended and renovated several times. On Christmas night of 1996, the Ramseys returned home from a holiday party hosted by friends. John and Patsy would later tell investigators that they put their sleeping daughter to bed as soon as they arrived home. What transpired in the dark hours that followed remains one of the most heavily debated cold cases in modern American criminal history. The timeline of the next morning began at approximately 5:30. Patsy Ramsey awoke and walked down the back spiral staircase of the home, a route she frequently used to get to the kitchen to make her morning coffee. There, spread out on the stairs, she discovered the 2.5-page handwritten note. The placement itself was curious. An intruder would not necessarily know that Patsy favored the spiral staircase over the main stairs connected to the third-floor master bedroom. The location seemed chosen simply because it was on the path connecting the upper floors to the main living areas, ensuring it would be found quickly. At 5:52 in the morning, despite explicit instructions in the note warning that speaking to anyone about the situation would result in her daughter being beheaded, Patsy Ramsey called 911 to report JonBenét missing. 2 police officers responded to the emergency call and arrived at the Ramsey home within 3 minutes. They conducted a cursory search of the vast house, looking for signs of forced entry. Officer Rick French made his way to the basement and stood before a door secured by a wooden latch at the top of the frame. Assuming that an intruder could not have locked the door from the inside and then escaped, French paused, but walked away without opening it. Behind that unexamined door lay the body of JonBenét Ramsey. Believing they were dealing with an active kidnapping, the police cordoned off only JonBenét's bedroom to prevent the contamination of evidence. The rest of the house remained unsecured. Meanwhile, the Ramseys contacted friends, victim advocates, and their minister, who all rushed to the home to offer support. These visitors inadvertently compromised the crime scene, picking up objects and cleaning surfaces in the kitchen as they waited for a kidnapper's phone call that would never come. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning to wait with the family and coordinate the expected ransom drop. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The deadline mentioned in the note, stating the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 in the morning, came and went. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Detective Arndt asked John Ramsey and a family friend, Fleet White, to search the house to see if anything seemed amiss. They descended into the basement. John went directly to the latched door that Officer French had overlooked hours earlier. He opened it to discover his daughter's lifeless body. The physical scene was harrowing, requiring clinical detachment to describe. JonBenét had been severely bludgeoned, suffering an 8.5-inch skull fracture. A garrote, intricately fashioned from a length of nylon cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush, was tied tightly around her neck, deeply embedding into the skin. A similar white cord bound her right wrist, and duct tape had been placed over her mouth. Her torso was covered by a white blanket. The subsequent autopsy would rule the official cause of death as asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. The coroner noted no conventional evidence of a sexual assault, though trauma to the area suggested it could not be completely ruled out, and noted that the area appeared to have been wiped with a cloth. In a moment of panic and profound shock, John Ramsey picked up his daughter's body, removed the duct tape from her mouth, and rushed upstairs. This desperate act further contaminated the crime scene, forever altering forensic evidence that might have provided clear answers. With the discovery of the body, the entire context of the morning shifted. This was no longer a kidnapping, it was a homicide. And the sprawling, bizarre ransom note left on the staircase transformed from a set of kidnappers' demands into the central piece of physical and psychological evidence in a murder investigation. Investigators quickly realized that the ransom note was not brought into the house by a prepared intruder. It was manufactured directly on the scene. The paper was identified as coming from a 5-inch by 8-inch lined legal pad kept in the Ramsey kitchen. The ink belonged to a black Sharpie felt-tip pen, also sourced from the home. Following the drafting of the note, both the pad and the pen were returned to their designated storage spaces. Even more chilling, investigators discovered physical indentations on the remaining sheets of the legal pad, revealing a discarded first attempt that was aborted after the writer initially addressed the letter to Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey. Additional practice attempts were located in the domestic trash. This meant the perpetrator did not simply sit down and write a quick demand. They practiced, they drafted, and they edited. The sheer mechanics of this act defy all established criminological baseline parameters for kidnapping. A typical ransom note is usually 10 to 30 words long, pre-prepared on untraceable paper, and dropped at the scene in a matter of seconds. The Ramsey note, by stark contrast, was an elaborate narrative execution that demanded a massive expenditure of time, dramatically increasing the on-site detection risk. Why would anyone, especially an intruder attempting to evade a sleeping family, take such an insane risk? The emerging theory among forensic experts and behavioral analysts was that the note was never intended to extract money. Instead, it was a piece of crime scene staging, a defensive narrative shield constructed to redirect law enforcement away from the domestic reality of the crime. Staging occurs when a perpetrator alters physical evidence to manipulate the investigation, often to make a domestic homicide appear to be the work of an outside intruder. A brief, direct note would have failed to build the complex, protective illusion required to insulate the household from immediate suspicion. By expanding the document to 3 pages, the author sought to establish a massive, overarching threat. The text claimed to be from a group of individuals representing a small foreign faction. The writer stated that they respected John Ramsey's business, but not the country that it serves. This international, anti-American narrative was clearly designed to shift the entire focus of the investigation to a geopolitical or corporate level, thereby distracting local Boulder detectives from looking closely at the family dynamics. The specific financial demand embedded in the text further highlighted the bizarre nature of the crime. The writer did not ask for a rounded, high value sum like $500,000 or $1 million, which would be standard for targeting a multimillionaire. Instead, the note demanded exactly $118,000. It specified that $100,000 should be in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. This precise figure was exceptional. It corresponded exactly to a corporate Christmas bonus John Ramsey had received from Access Graphics earlier that year. This indicated that the writer either had direct access to John's personal financial documents, had overheard discussions regarding the bonus, or was intimately familiar with his corporate compensation. Another theory suggested the number was a psychological transposition of John's outstanding financial liabilities, which were listed on his home computer as $1,118,000. Under intense psychological pressure, a writer might subconsciously abbreviate a larger, stressful figure when forced to invent a ransom amount. Either way, the highly localized financial knowledge pointed away from a random thrill killer and toward someone with close ties to the Ramsey household or John's business affairs. This localized knowledge was just the beginning of the document's psychological unraveling. Forensic linguists, who analyze word choice, syntactic structures, and grammar to construct demographic profiles, immediately noted profound cognitive contradictions within the text. A primary indicator of linguistic deception is semantic redundancy, or over-explanation. Under the intense pressure of fabricating a scenario, deceptive writers often provide far more detail than necessary, operating under the flawed assumption that a highly detailed account is inherently more believable. The sentence stating that at this time we have your daughter in our possession demonstrates this overwrought quality. The phrase in our possession is entirely redundant, as the state of possession is already structurally implied by the word have. Similarly, the opening demand to listen carefully relies on an auditory reference in a purely visual, handwritten medium. This slip reveals a writer who is performing a dramatic role, imagining a spoken dialogue rather than communicating a functional, urgent message. The spelling anomalies within the text further expose the artificiality of the persona. The author claims to represent a small foreign faction, a phrase seemingly designed to evoke international terrorism. Following this assertion, the writer misspells two common words, rendering business as business and possession with a single middle s. Yet, this same author flawlessly spells far more complex terms, such as deviation, execution, countermeasures, and the French word attaché, complete with the proper accent mark. Behavioral analysts view this as a strategic deployment of errors, a calculated attempt to simulate an uneducated or foreign writer that inevitably failed when the author's true, sophisticated vocabulary bled through. The grammar further betrays the facade of a unified group. While the first paragraph heavily utilizes the plural pronoun we, the mask slips by the second page. The writer suddenly shifts to the singular, stating I will call you, my instructions, and I advise you to be rested. This pronoun drift indicates that the crime was not committed by a faction, but by a solitary individual losing track of their own fabricated narrative. Even the specific prepositions used betray a chilling reality about the physical state of the victim at the time of authorship. The note refers to the two gentlemen watching over your daughter. In standard usage, a captor watches a hostage to prevent escape. A guardian or mourner, however, watches over someone who is sleeping, immobile, or deceased. By adding the unnecessary word over, the writer subconsciously telegraphed that they were not keeping a close eye on an active, living captive, but rather standing vigil over a stationary body. This linguistic leak aligns with the repeated threat that if instructions are violated, she dies. The writer uses this phrase 4 separate times instead of the future tense she will die. The phrasing inadvertently mirrors the grim reality of the basement wine cellar. The author could not threaten that the child would die, because the child was already dead. The tone of the document also lacks the raw, primal emotion expected from a ruthless cartel. Instead of focusing on the terror of the situation, the author dedicates hundreds of words to establishing bureaucratic rules, lecturing John Ramsey, and engaging in grandiose posturing. Certain phrases strike a bizarrely maternalistic or feminine chord. The author warns that the delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested, showing a highly out-of-place empathy for the extortion victim's sleep schedule. Later, the author taunts, "Don't try to grow a brain, John," a colloquialism that investigators noted is almost exclusively used by women to patronize men. The writer then urges him to use that good Southern common sense of yours. While John Ramsey was from the North, his wife Patsy was a former Miss West Virginia, making the appeal to Southern common sense a highly localized inside joke rather than the threat of a foreign terrorist. The document even utilizes transition words that matched the family's own unique lexicon. The note threatens an earlier delivery of the money and hence an earlier pickup of your daughter. The transition word hence, specifically the clunky pairing and hence, is incredibly rare in modern vernacular. Yet, in a 1997 printed Christmas message from the Ramsey family, the exact same phrasing appears, stating there would be no hope of eternal life, and, hence, no hope of ever being with our loved ones again. When later asked about this parallel, Patsy Ramsey claimed she had no idea why she used the phrase, suggesting it may have seeped into her subconscious after reading the ransom note so many times. To sustain this massive, 3-page allusion without having access to a genuine criminal background, the author was forced to draw heavily upon a mental library of Hollywood action thrillers. The note is less a ransom demand and more an intertextual collage of cinematic tropes. The 1986 film Ruthless People features a kidnapper demanding a specific black briefcase, instructing the victim to place $500,000 in unmarked, non-sequentially numbered $100 bills, and warning that if he notifies the police or deviates from instructions in any way whatsoever, his wife will be killed. The Ramsey note directly mirrors this rigid, rule-based structure and the obsessive denomination breakdown. The 1971 Clint Eastwood film Dirty Harry features a madman who kidnaps a young girl and subjects the protagonist to a grueling ransom drop. The cinematic killer warns that if the inspector talks to anyone, even a Pekingese dog pissing against a lamppost, the girl dies. In the Ramsey note, this famously specific threat mutated into the warning that if John Ramsey is caught talking to a stray dog, she dies. The Dirty Harry villain also mocks the inspector by saying it sounds like you had a good rest, you'll need it, directly echoed by the ransom note's bizarre concern for John Ramsey being rested for the delivery. The plagiarism continues across the decades. The 1994 blockbuster Speed contains the exact line, "Do not attempt to grow a brain." The 1996 thriller The Rock features a villain who establishes a rigid timeline and states he is aware of the protagonist's countermeasures, injecting the same military-style security jargon found in the Ramsey note. Perhaps most chillingly, the 1995 film Nick of Time features a plot centering on an unarmed political faction kidnapping a 6-year-old girl. The antagonist threatens the father, saying if he talks to a cop, they will cut the head off right in front of him. Records confirm that Nick of Time aired on a Boulder cable channel at 7:30 on Christmas night, just hours before the murder. Furthermore, the movie Ransom, starring Mel Gibson, was playing in theaters that very month. The film depicts the kidnapping of a wealthy businessman's child, who is bound with duct tape, while the kidnappers employ advanced counter-surveillance. The author of the JonBenét note did not invent a crime, they stitched together a fictional crisis from the cultural zeitgeist of the 1990s. From the perspective of physical forensic science, the sheer volume of this cinematic borrowing proved to be the writer's greatest vulnerability. Disguising one's handwriting is an intensive, conscious effort. The physical act of writing is controlled by automated, subconscious motor programs in the brain. When an individual attempts to alter their penmanship, they must constantly monitor and override these deeply ingrained neurological pathways. While a perpetrator might successfully maintain an artificial slant or spacing for a short sentence, it is cognitively and physically impossible to sustain a manual disguise over a 376-word document. As the physical task continues, cognitive fatigue sets in. The intense mental effort degrades, a phenomenon known as motor program drift occurs, and the writer naturally increases their speed to finish the tedious task. When speed increases, the disguise collapses, and the true handwriting emerges. A microscopic examination of the Ramsey note illustrates this progressive decay of disguise perfectly. On the first page, the handwriting is highly controlled, displaying a slow, tremulous line quality as the writer painstakingly drew each character. Document examiners noted extensive evidence of patching, which is the act of going back over letters to manually add artificial details. The writer manually added a second-story loop to the top of middle zone A's, added serifs to the T's, and added artificial caps to the F's. Ironically, this meticulous patching added a formal, feminine aesthetic to the first page that directly contradicted the aggressive threats. It also represented a massive behavioral anomaly. An anonymous writer typically attempts to mask their writing, making it messier or blockier. They do not typically patch up their writing to make it look more elegant. Forensic experts noted that this artificially patched copybook style heavily resembled Patsy Ramsey's own formal script, raising the dark possibility that the author, if an intruder, was deliberately using her household notepad to mimic her writing and frame the mother. As the text progressed onto the second and third pages, the disguise evaporated. The tremulous line quality steadily diminished, and the writing became significantly more fluid and rapid. The artificial, two-stroke patched letters disappeared entirely. The highly stylized A's deteriorated into a stunted, single-zone version. By accelerating, the writer stripped away their conscious shield and exposed their genuine, unconscious habits. Experts isolated this fluid writing at the end of the note and identified the writer's true natural script. It was characterized by a continuous, single-stroke D shaped like a closed fishhook, a U formed as a singular cup lacking a final downward stroke, an R resembling a closed checkmark, and a G with a lower loop pulling slightly to the right. This collapse of the disguise provided the Colorado Bureau of Investigation with a substantial volume of comparable material. During the investigation, detectives tested the handwriting of 73 individuals. John Ramsey was quickly and definitively excluded as the author. Patsy Ramsey, however, could not be eliminated. State handwriting examiners identified over 200 striking similarities between her historical writing samples and the natural, unmasked script that broke through on the final pages of the ransom note. One expert concluded that the handwriting showed profound indications that the writer was Patsy Ramsey, though she actively attempted to obscure her full range of penmanship during police testing. A federal court would later rule that while the similarities set off alarm bells, the evidence fell just short of a definitive, undeniable scientific match. The note ends with a final, confounding flourish, victory, followed by the initials S, B, T, C. There is no period after the C, indicating the writer intentionally and abruptly stopped. The cryptogram generated fierce debate and multiple theories regarding the author's identity. Given Patsy Ramsey's deep religious convictions, some analysts proposed the acronym meant Save by the Cross or Stand by the Cross, serving as a private plea for spiritual forgiveness in a moment of panic. Proponents of the intruder theory looked to John Ramsey's past. From 1968 to 1969, John served as an officer in the United States Navy, stationed at the Subic Bay Training Center in the Philippines. In this context, S, B, T, C could have been a highly personal, threatening reference left by a disgruntled acquaintance familiar with his military history. Still others pointed to John's own company, Access Graphics, where the acronym stood for Skill-Biased Technological Change, an economic term referring to the displacement of traditional labor by tech-savvy workers. This suggested the note might be the work of a vengeful, economically displaced employee. Whatever the true meaning, the signature was the final theatrical stamp on a document designed entirely to deceive. While the signature S.B.T.C. provided a theatrical conclusion to the document, the immediate actions of the Ramsey family provided a staggering behavioral contradiction to its explicit demands. The 3-page manifesto was relentlessly clear regarding law enforcement. It warned that speaking to anyone, including the police or the FBI, would result in the child being beheaded. It claimed the house was under constant scrutiny, and that any deviation from the instructions would trigger immediate execution. In genuine kidnapping scenarios, parents are typically paralyzed by these threats, prioritizing the safe return of their child above all else and demonstrating extreme compliance. Yet, at 5:52 in the morning, mere minutes after allegedly discovering this terrifying ultimatum, Patsy Ramsey called 911. John Ramsey then began contacting friends to come to the house. If the parents truly believed their daughter was in the hands of a ruthless foreign faction watching their every move, this immediate, blatant violation of the kidnappers' primary rule defies all psychological survival instincts. Behavioral analysts suggest this lack of hesitation indicates the caller already knew the threats were hollow. They did not fear the kidnappers' retaliation because they knew there were no kidnappers. Unfortunately, the arriving Boulder police officers did not share this insight. They treated the sprawling document as a legitimate extortion threat, a decision that fatally compromised the entire investigation. Because the note dictated a narrative of an abducted child and an off-site hostage situation, officers focused their limited containment efforts solely on JonBenét's bedroom. The rest of the sprawling mansion was left completely unsecured. As friends and victim advocates arrived to support the family, they wandered freely through the home. They wiped down kitchen counters, used the bathrooms, and swept away microscopic trace evidence. The legal pad and the Sharpie pen used to draft the 3-page deception were left out, handled, and contaminated. Because the note promised a phone call between 8 and 10 in the morning, detectives sat with the family, waiting for a ring that was never going to come. The ransom note had successfully weaponized the police department's own protocols against them, transforming what should have been a lockdown homicide scene into a chaotic waiting room. By the time John Ramsey descended into the basement at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and brought his daughter's lifeless body up the stairs, the forensic integrity of the house was irrevocably destroyed. If the note was a staged deception, who were the parents trying to protect? In 2016, a panel of elite investigators, including retired FBI profiler Jim Clemente and forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz, re-examined the case and proposed a chilling domestic timeline. According to their analysis, after the family returned from the Christmas party, John and Patsy put the children to bed. However, JonBenét later woke up and wandered downstairs to the kitchen, where her 9-year-old brother, Burke, was eating a late-night snack of pineapple. Autopsy results confirmed that JonBenét had undigested pineapple in her stomach, matching a bowl found on the kitchen table that bore Burke and Patsy's fingerprints. The investigative panel theorized that JonBenét reached into the bowl to steal a piece of fruit, triggering a sudden, explosive rage in her brother. In this scenario, Burke grabbed the nearest heavy object, a large metal mag light flashlight resting on the counter, and struck his sister in the head. The blow caused a massive, 8.5-inch skull fracture, instantly rendering her brain dead. Faced with the unthinkable reality of one child accidentally killing another, the parents panicked. To save their surviving son from institutionalization and to protect their prominent social legacy, they made the agonizing decision to cover up the domestic tragedy. They carried JonBenét to the basement, utilized a paintbrush and nylon cord to fashion a garrote, and strangled her to ensure death and simulate a sadistic sexual assault. Finally, Patsy sat down with her notepad to compose the sprawling, cinematic ransom note, deliberately incorporating John's bonus amount to point the police toward a disgruntled employee, and lifting dialogue from films like Dirty Harry and Speed to mimic a cartoonish villain. This theory accounts for the extreme length of the note, the lack of forced entry, the localized materials, and the handwriting similarities. Yet, just as the linguistic and behavioral evidence builds a seemingly insurmountable case against the family, the biological evidence completely shatters it. For those who believe an unknown intruder committed the murder, the physical crime scene contained anomalies that cannot be ignored. Retired homicide detective Lou Smith, who reviewed the case files for the district attorney's office, became the most vocal champion of the intruder theory. Smith pointed to a broken window in the basement, which John Ramsey claimed he had broken months earlier when locked out of the house. Beneath this window rested a suitcase, which Smith theorized an intruder intended to use to transport JonBenét out of the house before abandoning the plan. Furthermore, investigators discovered an unidentified footprint from a high-tech hiking boot near the body, a brand no one in the Ramsey family owned. A stray, unidentified palm print was also found on the wine cellar door. The most powerful evidence for the intruder theory emerged from the victim's own clothing. During the autopsy, trace amounts of foreign DNA were recovered from the bloodstains on JonBenét's underwear, and later from the long johns she was wearing. In 2003, advanced testing isolated a mixed genetic profile belonging to an unidentified male. This DNA definitively excluded John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey. It was submitted to the FBI's national database, but it matched no known offenders. For proponents of the intruder theory, this microscopic biological material is the ultimate trump card. It proves that a sadistic, sexually motivated predator infiltrated the home, subdued the child, took her to the basement, and murdered her. But if a phantom intruder committed the crime, the ransom note becomes an incomprehensible paradox. Real kidnappers and thrill killers operate on a strict timeline governed by the fear of discovery. They do not linger in a brightly lit kitchen or sit on a spiral staircase for 45 minutes to draft a 376-word manifesto. If the intruder wrote the note before waking JonBenét, they risked a parent coming downstairs for a glass of water and ending the plot immediately. If they wrote the note after the murder, they willingly sat in a house containing a dead body and 3 sleeping residents, taking the time to painstakingly return the Sharpie pen to its holder. Furthermore, why would a sadistic pedophile want to frame a small foreign faction? Why would a random intruder know the exact amount of John Ramsey's $118,000 Christmas bonus? And why would an outside killer utilize a handwriting style so remarkably similar to Patsy Ramsey's that state experts found over 200 points of comparison? Some forensic experts argue that the unidentified DNA could simply be a benign artifact of the manufacturing process, a genetic trace left by a factory worker who handled the underwear before it was packaged. They argue that a microscopic cell does not negate the overwhelming reality of the physical document left on the stairs. This irreconcilable dichotomy between the penmanship and the DNA paralyzed the justice system. In 1999, a Colorado grand jury convened to weigh the mountains of contradictory evidence. After hearing from handwriting analysts, DNA experts, and crime scene technicians, the grand jury made a stunning decision. They voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey. However, they did not indict them for premeditated murder. The true bills cited 2 counts each of child abuse resulting in death, and acting as accessories to a crime. The exact wording accused the parents of unlawfully and recklessly permitting a child to be placed in a situation that posed a threat to her life, and of rendering assistance to a person knowing they had committed a crime. The implication was clear: the grand jury believed the parents were covering for someone else in the house. But Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment. Looking at the unidentified male DNA and the hopelessly contaminated crime scene, Hunter calculated that he could never prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial. The grand jury's decision was sealed, hidden from the public for 14 years. The Ramseys maintained their innocence, launching defamation lawsuits against media outlets and investigators who accused them of the crime. In 2008, a new district attorney, Mary Lacey, took the extraordinary step of issuing a formal, public letter fully exonerating the Ramsey family, citing the touch DNA results as absolute proof of an outside killer. Yet, later prosecutors and police chiefs criticized this total absolution, arguing that exonerating anyone based on a microscopic, unlinked piece of trace evidence was legally reckless. Today, the Boulder Police Department maintains the case as an open, active homicide investigation, periodically analyzing the genetic material against new databases, hoping for a match that will finally explain the horrors of that Christmas night. Ultimately, the JonBenét Ramsey ransom note stands as the most elaborate, bizarre, and successful piece of crime scene staging in the history of American true crime. It is a document born of unimaginable panic, constructed from the borrowed dialogue of 1990s action films, and executed with a desperate, collapsing attempt at disguise. Whether it was written by a mother frantically trying to protect her family from a tragic domestic accident, or by an extraordinarily brazen intruder playing a sadistic psychological game, the note achieved its singular, overriding goal. It scattered the investigation into a dozen different, unprovable directions. It forced detectives to chase phantom foreign factions, trace naval acronyms, and hunt down corporate saboteurs. It created a fog of confusion so dense and impenetrable that nearly 30 years later, the truth remains entirely obscured. The author of those 3 pages knows exactly what happened in the dark basement of that Boulder mansion. But the paper itself, with its patched letters, cinematic threats, and localized financial demands, remains a silent witness to a perfect, agonizingly unresolved crime. I am JonBenét, and this has been Criminally Drawn. If you want the next real case drawn the same way, subscribe to Criminally Drawn. I'm JonBenét. Thank you for watching.